For months, people have been asking the same question. What exactly happened to Celeste Rivas Hernandez? While rumors and speculation have spread across social media, much of what the public has heard until now has come from unofficial sources. But inside a packed courtroom this week, the case entered a new phase. For the first time, investigators took the stand and publicly described what prosecutors say they uncovered during their investigation. Over the course of the hearing, the courtroom heard testimony about the timeline, the evidence investigators say they collected, and the sequence of events they believe led to this tragic case. At the same time, it is important to remember one key fact. These are allegations presented by prosecutors during a preliminary hearing. The defense disputes those allegations, and D4vd has pleaded not guilty. The court has not determined guilt, and the legal process is still underway. Today, we're taking you inside that courtroom. We'll walk through the testimony in the order it unfolded, explain what investigators said, examine how prosecutors are building their case, and look at the questions that still remain unanswered. By the end of this video, you'll have a clearer understanding of what was actually said in court and what could happen next. Welcome to Brian Case Records. If you appreciate carefully researched, fact-based coverage of major criminal investigations, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss future updates. Before the first witness was called, and before investigators took the stand, the courtroom was already filled with emotion. Family members, members of the media, and spectators gathered to hear, for the first time in a public courtroom, how prosecutors say this case unfolded. The hearing marked an important stage in the legal process. Unlike a trial, a preliminary hearing is not where guilt or innocence is decided. Instead, the judge considers whether prosecutors have presented enough evidence for the case to move forward to trial. Even so, these hearings often provide the public with the clearest picture yet of an investigation because detectives and other witnesses testify under oath. That is why so much attention was focused on this hearing. According to prosecutors, the case centers on the disappearance and death of Celeste Rivas Hernandez, a teenage girl whose family had been desperately searching for answers. Her disappearance quickly drew concern from investigators in the community, and as the investigation progressed, detectives began gathering evidence they believed pointed them toward a suspect. As investigators worked to reconstruct the timeline, they collected physical evidence, interviewed witnesses, reviewed digital records, and executed search warrants.
20 counts of which he has been charged. First-degree murder with special circumstances, the count of lewd and lascivious acts with a 13-year-old, and the count of mutilation of human remains.
The singer faces those charges after Hernandez's body was found in the trunk.
Prosecutors argue that these investigative steps gradually revealed a sequence of events they believe explains what happened to Celeste. Those conclusions, however, are strongly disputed by the defense. Throughout the hearing, the defense maintained that prosecutors had not proven their allegations and reminded the court that the evidence would ultimately need to be tested at trial. That distinction is important because everything presented during a preliminary hearing is part of the prosecution's effort to establish probable cause, not a final determination of guilt. With that legal framework established, the hearing moved to one of its most anticipated moments. An investigator involved in the case was called to the witness stand. As the detective began answering questions, the courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Over the next several hours, prosecutors carefully walked the witness through the investigation, asking about the timeline, evidence collection, and the discoveries investigators say became central to the case. It was during this testimony that the public began hearing details that had never before been explained in open court. Some of those details were expected. Others surprised nearly everyone in the courtroom. And as the detective continued speaking, prosecutors began presenting what they described as one of the most significant parts of their case. As the courtroom settled into silence, prosecutors called one of the lead investigators to the witness stand. What followed was not dramatic courtroom argument, but a methodical walkthrough of the investigation. The prosecutor began by asking the detective to explain how the case developed from a missing person investigation into a homicide investigation. Step by step, the detective described how investigators gathered information, followed leads, and assembled what prosecutors believe is a timeline of events. The testimony focused on the investigative process rather than opinions. The detective explained how search warrants were obtained, how evidence was collected, and how investigators documented each step as the case progressed. Prosecutors then shifted to one of the most closely watched portions of the hearing, evidence they say was uncovered during the investigation. According to testimony presented in court, investigators reviewed records they believed were relevant to the case. Prosecutors argued that these records helped them better understand the sequence of events after Celeste Rivas Hernandez disappeared. One of the most widely reported moments came when prosecutors discussed purchases that investigators allege were made after Celeste's disappearance. According to testimony in court, investigators identified purchases that they say included items such as body bags, chainsaws, a shovel, and other materials. Prosecutors argued that these purchases were significant to their theory of the case. It is important to emphasize that these claims were presented by the prosecution during the preliminary hearing. They have not been proven in court, and the defense disputes the allegations. As those details were read into the record, the courtroom reportedly became increasingly emotional. Family members listened closely while journalists documented each new development. For many people following the case, this was the first time they had heard prosecutors publicly explain how these alleged purchases fit into their investigation. The prosecutor continued questioning the detective, asking how investigators connected these pieces of evidence to the broader timeline they were presenting. Rather than relying on a single piece of evidence, prosecutors suggested that their case is built from multiple parts, working together physical evidence, witness interviews, digital records, and forensic analysis. Their argument is that, taken together, these elements support the charges filed in the case. The defense, however, has consistently maintained that prosecutors' interpretation of the evidence should not be accepted as proof of guilt. That disagreement lies at the heart of the legal battle that will continue if the case proceeds to trial. Then the hearing moved to another powerful moment. Prosecutors introduced testimony about what investigators discovered during the forensic phase of the investigation, a section of the hearing that many people in the courtroom found especially difficult to hear. As the hearing continued, prosecutors turned the court's attention to the forensic evidence collected during the investigation. This portion of the testimony was noticeably more emotional than anything that had come before. The detective was asked to explain how investigators documented the evidence they recovered and how forensic specialists became involved. Prosecutors used this testimony to describe the investigative steps they say helped them reconstruct what they believe happened. During the hearing, prosecutors also presented graphic forensic photographs as part of their evidence. Because of the nature of those images, the atmosphere inside the courtroom changed almost immediately. According to multiple news reports, many people in the gallery became visibly emotional as the photographs were shown. Family members of Celeste Rivas Hernandez listened as prosecutors continued presenting their case, while members of the media carefully documented the proceedings. Out of respect for Celeste, her loved ones, and everyone affected by this tragedy, we will not describe the graphic details shown in court. Those images remain part of the legal proceedings, and our goal is to focus on the verified facts rather than sensationalizing the case. Instead, what matters for understanding this hearing is why prosecutors introduced that evidence. Their position is that the forensic findings support the timeline they have presented to the court. They argue that the physical evidence, when viewed alongside witness testimony, digital records, and other investigative findings, forms the foundation of the charges in this case. The defense, however, does not accept that conclusion. Defense attorneys have continued to argue that prosecutors have not proven their case and that the evidence should be thoroughly examined before any conclusions are reached. They maintain that the allegations remain just that, allegations, and that D4vd is presumed innocent unless proven guilty in court. That distinction is one of the most important principles in the criminal justice system. A preliminary hearing is designed to determine whether there is enough evidence for the case to proceed, not whether the defendant is guilty. As the hearing moved forward, prosecutors shifted from the forensic evidence to another major part of their case. They began explaining what investigators believe was the motive behind the alleged crime. As the hearing entered another critical stage, prosecutors turned away from the physical evidence and began explaining why they believe the alleged crime occurred. In criminal cases, establishing a motive is not required to obtain a conviction. However, prosecutors often present a theory that they believe helps explain the sequence of events and the decisions they allege were made. During the preliminary hearing, prosecutors outlined what they say was the motive behind the alleged crime. According to their presentation, they believe Celeste Rivas Hernandez was killed to prevent information about an alleged relationship from becoming public. This is the prosecution's theory based on the evidence they presented to the court, and it remains contested by the defense. The detective testified about how investigators reached that conclusion during the course of their investigation. Prosecutors argued that witness interviews, digital evidence, and other investigative findings all contributed to the theory they presented before the judge. It is important to emphasize that this testimony represents the prosecution's allegations. The defense has not accepted those conclusions and continues to dispute them. As of this hearing, no judge or jury has determined that those allegations have been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. That legal distinction is essential. In the public eye, cases like this often move quickly, with opinions forming long before a trial begins. Inside a courtroom, however, the process is much slower. Every piece of evidence is subject to challenge, and both sides have the opportunity to question witnesses and present their arguments. As prosecutors continued their presentation, the courtroom remained focused on one central question. Had they presented enough evidence for the case to move forward to trial? That is the purpose of a preliminary hearing. The judge is not deciding whether the defendant is guilty. Instead, the judge must determine whether prosecutors have shown sufficient evidence for the criminal case to proceed through the justice system. For Celeste's family, the hearing represented another step in a long search for answers. While it could not erase their loss, it allowed them to hear investigators publicly explain the work that had gone into the case and the evidence prosecutors believe supports the charges. For the defense, however, the hearing was another opportunity to argue that the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence should not be mistaken for proof, and that every allegation must ultimately withstand the scrutiny of a trial. As the day drew to a close, attention shifted to what would happen next. Would the judge find that prosecutors had met the legal standard required to move the case forward? And if so, what would the next phase of the legal process look like? As the preliminary hearing concludes, the case now stands at another important crossroads. Everything presented during the hearing, from the detective's testimony to the forensic evidence and the prosecution's theory of the case, was intended to answer one legal question. Has the prosecution presented enough evidence for the case to move forward to trial? That is the decision now before the court. If the judge determines that the legal standard has been met, the case will proceed to the next stage of the criminal justice process, where both sides will have additional opportunities to present evidence, challenge testimony, and argue their positions before a jury. If not, the charges or parts of the case could be affected, depending on the court's ruling. Regardless of the outcome of this hearing, one thing is clear: this case is far from over. As more court proceedings take place, additional witnesses may testify, new evidence could be introduced, and legal arguments from both the prosecution and the defense will continue to shape how the case develops. Many of the questions people have today may not be answered until much later in the legal process. For the family of Celeste Rivas Hernandez, every court appearance represents another difficult reminder of their loss. Throughout the proceedings, they have continued seeking answers while watching the legal process unfold in public. For the defense, the focus remains on challenging the prosecution's evidence and maintaining that D4vd is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in a court of law. That presumption is a fundamental principle of the justice system and will remain in place throughout the case. As journalists and legal analysts continue following each hearing, this investigation will likely remain the subject of significant public attention. Future court filings, rulings, and testimony could all affect the direction of the case. Here on Bryan Case Records, our commitment is to report those developments responsibly. We'll continue separating verified facts from speculation and explaining what happens in court as new information becomes publicly available. If you found this breakdown helpful, consider subscribing to Bryan Case Records and turning on notifications so you don't miss future updates on this case and other major criminal investigations. Your support helps us continue producing carefully researched, fact-based coverage. Finally, we'd like to hear from you. What do you think was the most significant moment from this preliminary hearing, and what questions do you still believe remain unanswered? Share your thoughts in the comments below. As always, please keep the discussion respectful. Remember that this is an ongoing legal case, and everyone involved deserves fairness and respect while the judicial process continues. Thank you for watching Bryan Case Records. Stay safe, and we'll see you in the next investigation.